Hello, I'm Azday Mashuri. Welcome to the program, which is live from Islamabad, where we were expecting peace talks between the United States and Iran to end weeks of war. But those talks are now very much uncertain. And in the meantime, in the last few hours, we've been receiving reports of attacks on at least 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the latest we're hearing is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran is claiming that they've transferred 2 ships to Iranian waters for what they've said are inspections. We'll have more on that in a bit, and our BBC Verify team is also going to break down what they've been gathering. But in the meantime, let's look at the state of play right now. President Trump has extended a ceasefire between the United States and Iran. He says it will last until Iran presents a unified proposal and until discussions are concluded one way or the other. The United States has countered Iran's effective blockade in the Strait of Hormuz with one of its own on Iranian ports, and President Trump has said it will continue. That's a problem for Iran. That said, it won't return to the negotiations until that US blockade is lifted. Now, if you remember, we did think JD Vance, the US Vice President, would board a plane yesterday to reach Islamabad for peace talks, but that trip is now on hold. So what now? As I was saying earlier, we've been receiving those breaking news lines that at least 3 cargo ships have been shot at by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in the Strait of Hormuz. As Tehran continues to impose those restrictions on the key waterway, the BBC has confirmed that the vessels are registered in Greece, the UAE and Panama, but so far no casualties have been reported. So let's look a little closer at what we're hearing. I have our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's here with us now. Paul, the situation seems to be changing every hour. What is the latest right now?
Well, as you say, we've seen an escalation this morning, as a day, in the Gulf, close to and around the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that was always a possibility, given that in the wake of the American interception, and firing on Iranian vessels and intercepting them, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard said that they were likely to retaliate. Now, that could have been put off if there had been a successful round of negotiations here. We could have been talking about those negotiations right now, but it hasn't happened. And as a result, I think we are seeing that slightly inevitable escalation in the Gulf itself. That doesn't necessarily mean that the ceasefire is in jeopardy. Obviously, Donald Trump has extended it for an indefinite period of time, saying he's willing to allow space for negotiation. But with those tensions so high, it is always possible that things could escalate and a kind of conflict at sea could spill over once again into a conflict on land. So I think we are in that very febrile situation now where Pakistan, which had really high hopes of hosting another round of talks, possibly a decisive round of talks this week, I think probably feels that it's sort of slipped out of its grasp, at least for now. And it's worth remembering just a couple of dates in Donald Trump's diary that are coming up. The King, the British King, is due in Washington on Monday for a state visit. A couple of weeks after that, Donald Trump is due to go to China for an even more important visit. He doesn't want the war in Iran, the kind of messy, unpredictable, possibly about to break out into the open again war, hanging over him. So I think he's going to be keen for some kind of deal, even if it's a deal that patches over the immediate issues and kicks forward the negotiations on the big stuff to the future. And I bet you the Iranians are acutely conscious of those 2 events and are kind of playing on them.
Right, and trying to run down the clock.
Yeah.
Paul, thank you for that. Paul's going to be with us for the rest of the day as he's watching those developments. Ben Chu at BBC Verify has also been trying to pick apart what we're hearing. There have been reports on some of these attacks by the UK Maritime Agency as well. Here he is with more.
The day after President Donald Trump announced an extension of the ceasefire with Iran, 3 vessels have come under fire in the Strait of Hormuz. Here's what we know about them. BBC Verify understands that the first was a container ship called the Epaminondas, which is owned by a Greek company. According to the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operation, UKMTO, the body to which vessels report dangerous incidents, the vessel was approached by one IRGC gunboat at 3:55 GMT, while 15 nautical miles from Oman. Now, IRGC refers to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it was fired upon, resulting in heavy damage to the bridge. Importantly, the Epaminondas was not transmitting its position via radio transponder while crossing the strait, possibly to avoid detection. It only pops up here, and this underlines that ship tracking data only gives us a partial picture of maritime activity in the strait, and we have to use other sources such as satellite data to show the fullest possible picture. Now, a second ship, which according to the maritime intelligence firm Vanguard was the MSC Francesca, was fired upon at some time after 05:05 GMT, while approximately 6 nautical miles off the coast of Iran. Third ship, which we understand was a Panama flag vessel called the Euphoria, also reported being fired upon at 6:38 GMT, 8 nautical miles west of Iran, though this one did not specify it was attacked by the IRGC. Now, Iran has said the strait will remain closed while the US maintains its own blockade on Iranian ports. And Donald Trump has said that the US blockade will remain in force despite announcing the ceasefire extension. US CENTCOM has claimed its blockade is working and that the US Navy has directed 28 vessels to turn around or return to port since it began, although Verify estimates using ship tracking data and other sources that a number of Iranian-linked vessels have actually crossed the US's blockade line, shown here, since it was imposed in one direction or another. It's also worth noting that the attacks on commercial shipping by the IRGC are at odds with President Trump's claims that Iran's offensive naval capabilities have been totally destroyed.
That was Ben Chu at BBC Verify. So as we're trying to understand the viability of these peace talks, whether they do happen and whether people do travel here to Islamabad, what has Iran been saying? We know that the advisor to Iran's Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who was expected to lead the Iranian delegation here, his advisor has called President Donald Trump's ceasefire extension meaningless and has even accused it of being a ploy for a surprise attack. That's how deep the mistrust is between the two sides. Now, our chief international correspondent, Lyse Doucet, has been reporting from Iran under the condition that none of her material is used by our BBC Persian service. That's actually a restriction that all international media outlets must abide by when they're reporting from inside of Iran. She's been able to speak to not only officials, but also people on the ground there to get the view from Iran. Take a listen.
The first reactions to President Trump's ceasefire announcement on social media by official aides and spokespersons were predictable, skeptical, defiant. An advisor to Iran's lead negotiator described it as meaningless. He said it was just a ploy to buy more time for a surprise attack. Two previous rounds of negotiations last year and this year were shattered by surprise attacks, so it underscores the deep distrust here of diplomacy. Iran, though, has its own commitments to keep under this truce, but it says it's not going to open that strategic Strait of Hormuz until the US lifts its naval blockade of Iran's ports. So that's where the impasse is now, and there's no sense of how and when it will be resolved. When we speak to Iranians here, we hear a range of views. Iranians who are taking to the squares of this city every night in response to their government's call are also defiant. Others we speak to are just trying to get on with their lives, exhausted by years of failed nuclear talks, sanctions, spiraling prices, tighter security and surveillance, all of the many restrictions on their freedoms and on their futures.
There's our chief international correspondent, Lyse Doucet. So what does all of this mean when it comes to nuclear negotiations? One of the biggest stumbling blocks in all of this. Iran wants to continue enriching uranium. Donald Trump says that nuclear program is exactly one of his core aims, controlling it, restricting it. One person who was involved in the initial negotiations for that JCPOA deal, the nuclear deal under the Obama administration, is Alan Ayer with the Middle East Institute. Now he was formerly from the State Department. Alan, good to have you. Those negotiations were extremely complex. They took a great deal of time. What were your expectations this week when it comes to this next round of negotiations, if they had happened?
I think the what's happening now reminds me of the first 3 years we did nuclear negotiations with Iran, from 2010 to 2013, where neither side was really that eager to negotiate. It was performed, punctured. We spent as much time trying to negotiate about where to meet to negotiate as about actual issues. So what I'm taking away from the developments of the last 48 hours is that for a variety of reasons, neither side is really that keen to negotiate with the other. They're each vying for sort of more marginal leverage.
And Alan, could you remind us, when Donald Trump stepped away from the JCPOA deal in his first term in office, what was he saying simply wasn't good enough about that deal?
I think he said because it allowed some indigenous enrichment. It allowed Iran to continue enriching on Iranian soil. There were some time limitations in the deal. So, yeah, it wasn't a perfect deal, but it was far better than the alternative. And had President Trump wished to improve it, he had the option of negotiating a better, stronger deal without ripping up the JCPOA. Unfortunately, he chose to rip it up.
And Alan, right now, obviously, we're seeing these events in the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing that control of Strait of Hormuz, the long-term goal Iran has of declaring its sovereignty, as it put it, over the strait, as a key challenge here. But these are different people across the negotiating table in some ways, aren't they? Abbas Araghchi was involved in those initial negotiations. But how has the regime changed? Because Donald Trump is claiming that it has been regime change.
Well, there had been regime change, but the new regime is more militaristic and more hardline. And it's also lost a coordinating figure at the top, in that when Ayatollah Khamenei, the father, was alive, he settled internal disputes and he sort of laid down the line and people followed it. You don't have that now. His son doesn't have that power. So domestic squabbles among various factions that could have been solved more quickly probably are taking a little longer now. Plus, as I said, you've got a government that's trying to work out relationships internally with each other and are really not in the mood to negotiate with a country that's killed most of its leadership and is still attacking them.
So, Alan, what do you make of the road to diplomacy now? Is there any way to bridge that deep mistrust between the two countries?
Not just deep mistrust, it's just that, it's like a slot machine. If everything is lined up, you get a payout. Everything is not lined up in either the United States, which is approaching domestic midterm elections. So President Trump is loath to give any sort of carrot or inducement to Iran. And it's not lined up in Iran because, as I said, you're lacking. It's a new system, new people, new relationships, and they're not willing to show leniency or toward the United States. So, yeah, I'm quite pessimistic about the chance of a negotiated outcome. Far more likely that this ceasefire just keeps rolling, but ceasefires are intrinsically unstable. So I think escalation is in the cards unless something significant changes.
Yeah, that is the big question now, isn't it? Alan, thank you so much for your insight, former State Department official who is now with the Middle East Institute. Now, the last time that we were here in Islamabad for that first round of talks, the Iranians had made a key demand before negotiations could begin. They said there needed to be a ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel. There is a 10-day truce that is now in place. The two sides are due to have another round of diplomatic talks on Thursday, hosted by the White House. With more on the situation there and how that fits in with everything going on between the United States and Iran is our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Now.
So, when it comes to Lebanon, at dawn this morning, there are reports from Lebanon that one person was killed and two wounded in what was said to be an Israeli drone strike. We've asked the Israeli military about that, and it says it's unaware of such an attack. But this comes after yesterday, the Israeli military said that there were drones and rockets launched by Hezbollah targeting its soldiers who remain on the ground in their thousands in the south of the country. And Hezbollah said it had done that because of violations of the ceasefire, saying that there had been attacks on Lebanese civilians by the Israeli military, that the Israeli military was continuing to destroy homes and villages in southern Lebanon. which Israel sees really as being a Hezbollah stronghold. And this just underlines for you how fragile that 10-day ceasefire that came into force on Friday morning, how fragile it remains. And Hezbollah has made clear that it opposes those direct talks scheduled to take place in Washington at the State Department on Thursday between Israel and Lebanon, these two countries that have technically remained at war since the State of Israel was created in 1948. Naim Qassem, who's the leader of Hezbollah, said that the talks were futile. The Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, came out defending them, saying it's not a weakness, it's not a retreat to hold such talks, and basically laying out how for Lebanon the objectives there are to end Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, to have the Lebanese army deployed right up to the border, basically about regaining sovereignty. Israel, when it talks about its objectives in these talks, has got a long-term goal of having a peace deal with Lebanon. It wants a proper delineation of the border. It wants to make sure that Hezbollah is completely disarmed and it can no longer pose a threat to its communities in the north, which have been in parallel to the war in Iran, have been under rocket fire and drone attack. So the Israelis have been saying that they will maintain a presence on the ground in southern Lebanon. So that is going to be, a real obstacle when it comes to these talks.
That was our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell. Now, as a reminder, we are continuing to receive these breaking news reports, developments in the last few hours about multiple attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The latest we know is that 3 cargo ships have been attacked. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is claiming they've seized 2 of those ships, that they're transferring them to Iran's waters for what they called inspection. And that is happening as that big question keeps hovering above us here, which is, will the two sides choose the path of diplomacy, or are we going to see further conflict? We'll bring all the latest for you here from Islamabad, but for now we're going to take a short break. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.